I had an interesting epiphany at the age of 26. I was on the patio of my buddy's house in Newport and I was talking with people. And, somebody asked me a question about some social issue. And then I answered the question. And then I asked them some questions. And when they said, I don't know anything about that, I didn't study it, that right there sent a light bulb off. Because when they asked me the questions, I didn't study that either. And what happened is I realized that people didn't think at all. I realized something that the most people, 99.9% of the people I've ever encountered don't think. Because they think that thinking is parroting and paraphrasing knowledge that they've acquired through memorizing words. And they have profound fear of being wrong that comes from the education system that indoctrinated them to be this way. Complete intellectual and emotional dependence on a system for generating a false identity as an adaptive mechanism against their own fear of failure, not belonging, and abandonment. And so when I would talk to people, I would find that they would become afraid of talking to me. And so I always had to limit myself in every social environment. It always resulted in my ouster. People would think I'm a know-it-all. People would question my credentials. It doesn't matter what I do. Now that it's psychology and I've conquered the entire subjective reality and I know everything you need to know about mental illnesses to cure them all, I know that. And I'm talking about the neuroscience that could literally form a pill that would create enlightenment simply by either invoking parasympathetic activity while simultaneously turning off the efferent signals that impair the formation or the transmission of consciousness into the moment. And that enlightenment is nothing more than a parasympathetic activation. I do it manually by turning off each trigger. Where meditation would be like pulling a circuit breaker on a house, I just turn off each light until a whole mansion appears. Because the ego is a tiny dissociative space of the mind that had to create analytical thinking to compensate due to a total loss of awareness that happens in early childhood to the point where, because it happens at such an early age, and it doesn't happen due to thinking, it has to do with the observation of emotional changes in fight or flight that are falsely attributed to this notion that there's something wrong with me. That the fight or flight mechanism induces a universal sensation in all animals and humans alike that says something is wrong here and initiates an inquiry into the world around us, where the world around us is a neurological formation of the mind. And so the consciousness expands so that the organism is sensitive to the external environment because animals hide from each other. And so a rabbit has tall ears so it can capture the sounds of the wings of an owl or a hawk, and it can smell rattlesnakes. But you see, if a rabbit gets aroused from sleep, from the rustling of leaves, it's going to wake up real quick, pupils will dilate, it'll be prepared for a fight or flight reaction, but it's not in fight or flight yet because it's a two-stage system. Now, if the rabbit does not see something, the feeling of something's wrong relaxes away and it goes back to sleep. Just like my dog waking up to inspect the house if it hears a noise at night. But the fight or flight reaction causes a complete cognitive change because this big world that the animal is searching for the something within collapses to the size of a predatory threat, and every behavior that the rabbit could invoke disappears from the awareness of the rabbit due to the amygdala blocking any element of awareness or emotional response to environmental stimuli to fixate and forcibly focus on the immediate threat. The need to survive supersedes all other dynamics because fear is not just an emotion. Fear is the organizing principle of reality on a moment-to-moment basis. And so the sympathetic nervous system is part of the autonomic branch, and it contains the fight or flight, and it wakes us up in the morning. And you wake up in the morning full of anxiety and you start organizing your thoughts because your thoughts in a subjective space are only organized around all of your perceived problems. And you fixate on your problems and get yourself stuck in dead-end jobs, dead-end relationships, trying to fix and change yourself to avoid abandonment. And what I will tell you is that that is all it comes down to, is that the subconscious mind observed in psychology has nothing to do with anything other than it is the neurologically impaired brain that the higher self and the awakening, the spiritual awakening, the enlightenment, the Satori, the kingdom of God, God itself, is synonymous. These are all the same experiences. Some people might take ayahuasca, some people might meditate, some people might have this happen spontaneously. But all that causes an awakening is a parasympathetic activation that partially or completely turns off fear, the voice in the mind vanishes, and then what happens is the forced fixation upon one's own suffering emotional state, which is a preoccupation with these malformed emotions, vanishes. And then a new view of reality emerges, where profound empathy and cognitive power emerge, and then everything that was in the past, that was neurologically removed from reality, is now part of the awareness, and they would call that a revelation. Why it would be a revelation is that as you live life with your mind organized around fear, it's just like if you were in an emergency watching a movie and you had to get out of there now. At a loud bang and you're running for the exit. You found the exit with no effort because suddenly you formed a subconscious, and the mind absorbed the entire environment and eradicated all elements from your awareness and only allowed you to see the exit. And so the amygdala, its purpose was to block emotions and block behavioral drives by blocking the awareness of the animal. Because an animal without a human consciousness does not know it's alive, and so it experiences being alive. It doesn't know it'll die if it gets eaten. It just knows it's afraid, so it runs. It doesn't know that if it doesn't eat, it'll die. It just knows it's hungry. It doesn't know that it's going to have babies if it mates. If an animal knew that babies were going to rip its way out of its body, it probably wouldn't want to mate. You see, if I blocked fear in animals and I blocked hunger in animals, they'd all perish. If I gave human malformed emotions of fear, of failure, and rejection, just fear, failure, and rejection to any animal species, they don't last one generation. Because the humans do have consciousness, they fight against these maladaptive fight or flight based projectiles that define the future based on these dynamics that are avoided in the same way animals avoid other animals. And everything that is destroying the lives of human beings are nonsensical, non-real fears that are experientially the equivalent of the threat of life and death. That people fear failure like death. People fear disappointment like death. People experience adult abandonment, and it makes them feel like they can't continue. It makes them feel small, helpless. And because these dynamics are fear-based fight or flight fixations on me, the observation of your depressed emotional states confirms the brokenness, confirms there's something wrong with you. And so the neurological changes invoked by the triggers is confirming of the triggers, reaffirming of the triggers, and cause prolonged grieving and a need for external validation, a need for subjective understanding to bury the past. And all the understanding does is explain something that the human mind has never been able to escape, other than in enlightenment practices from the East. Western psychology actually embodies victimhood by assigning the causality of suffering to past experiences called traumas, when those traumas are actually experienced through the ego that was developed at such an early age and absent thoughts, that many of the words that you describe, like abandonment, were experienced by you as a child before you even had the words for it, because emotions are experienced just like colors are experienced without words. That if you didn't have language, you would still feel the same things. But you see, it was language that invented me, an illusory segregation from the first person perspective that's restored in enlightenment. And so enlightenment was the term they used because they thought, just like psychology does, that the presentation of this fear-based hierarchical machine called ego was a normal human being, and that this enlightenment was some transition into some spiritual world, when it wasn't. Where enlightenment is only neurologically normal, and these neurodivergent people that you traumatize and stigmatize were God's gift to humanity.